Hello, everyone. Happy midday or whatever time it is where you're tuning in from. I'm Garrett Nelson, the Curator of Maps and Director of Geographic Scholarship at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And you are tuned in to Angles on Bending Lines. That's our series of virtual talks on themes related to our current exhibition, Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception. Before we start, I want to begin by calling attention to the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical and present geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston, where I'm broadcasting from, is the ancestral and current home to indigenous peoples, including the Mashpee and Aquinnah Wampanoag tribes, the Nipmuc nations, and descendants of the Massachusetts people. Copley Square sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. The maps that are in our collections bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts ranging from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, the maps don't simply document these stories, but they actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Through all of our programs and interpretation, we always encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real consequences on the present day. Those themes are very much present in our Bending Lines exhibition, where we take a close look at how maps shape what we know and believe about the world around us, and in turn, how those forms of geographic representation can distort the truth, intentionally or unintentionally. Because our gallery at the Central Library in Copley Square is still closed and has been closed now for more than a year, we've made Bending Lines an interactive online exhibition. You can visit Bending Lines at the link below to dive into the dozens of maps that were produced, dozens of maps throughout history that were produced in order to make a point. Those range from political propaganda to commercial advertising to social activism. In Bending Lines, however, we're not only interested in historic maps and maps that are obviously trying to convince you of something. We also pay attention to the exploding proliferation of geospatial information in today's world. And we encourage our viewers to become more critically informed consumers of information that claims to be simply and unproblematically true. Whether questioning the racial categories that the census has used to collect data over time, or looking at how the very same geospatial data set can be used to draw conflicting and contradictory conclusions in different maps, Bending Lines turns a careful eye to the many human choices that are always layered into the kinds of information and representation that we collectively call data. So it's this topic that we're now exploring in a 4-part series of conversations this spring, starting today with Matthew Bowie. Before I introduce Dr. Bowie, I want to note that the Bending Lines exhibition is supported by a grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, and all of our work is made possible by the Boston Public Library. The Leventhal Center is an independent nonprofit that relies on contributions from viewers like you to support our free programs in areas ranging from geographic research and public talks to K-12 education and the preservation of our collections. If you enjoyed today's event, consider visiting leventhalmap.org/donate afterwards. Even a donation of just a few dollars can help support our mission of making our programs free and accessible to all. Now, I want to introduce today's guest in the Angles on Bending Lines series, Dr. Matthew Bowie. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Garrett.
Matt is currently an assistant professor and postdoctoral fellow at the NYU Alliance for Public Interest Technology, and he begins next fall as an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. Matt's work is on the intersection of digital information, data, and racial justice in everyday life. And he's working on several fascinating research projects considering how geographic information should raise our skepticism and raise our caution, not only in a critical way, but also in a way that makes us think about what alternatives and possibilities exist at the intersection between mapping, data, and social life. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt to begin this conversation. Then he and I will have a little chat. But I'll draw your attention to the fact that you can comment at any time, whether you're on YouTube or on Facebook. We will see your comments, and we've reserved the last third of today's talk as an audience Q&A. So feel free to put in comments or questions throughout the talk, or certainly when we get to the end, the Q&A section. We really welcome questions from the audience. So Matt, I want to begin with you. I want to pose a broad question to you, which is, why should we be careful about data? Isn't data just facts about the world? What are some of the reasons why, when we're thinking about data, and particularly geographic data, what are the reasons why we should be careful, and what should we do with it?
Yeah, thanks, Garrett, for that great question. I'm going to share some slides because I have some prepared comments. Before we jump in, I just want to do a minor correction in case this gets on the recording. I will be an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, but next fall I will first be a postdoc. Just a clarification, but eventually next fall, the fall after, I will be. But to begin, as we think about this question, as we think about the exhibition on bending lines and on angles, I'm really thinking about this coalescing around this narrative of data as truth. Right, so as social media is gathering data, as data-driven initiatives are proliferating around the smart city, Boston is just one of those examples of data not always getting it right. And I show this picture of a school bus because as I think about smart cities, data-driven initiatives, I'm thinking about the ways in which there were recommendations to mitigate traffic congestion in Boston. One of the data-driven recommendations was starting school around 7 a.m. For any parents in the room, I think this was 2017 or for the 2017-2018 school year. There was a lot of hubbub in Boston because a lot of parents were not happy about the prospect of taking their children to school half an hour earlier at 7 a.m. And I share this example in thinking about bending lines and thinking about angles on bending lines because often we hear this narrative of data is helpful because it's truthful, it's objective. But how do we actually shine a light to the ways that it doesn't always serve the truth? It has contested meanings, that there are two sides of a coin. There are contesting forces at play too, conflicts and tension. And especially I'm thinking about, so I actually come through this work as not as a geographer, but as a communication scholar, thinking about the narratives we can tell with data, with maps, but just thinking about what can we tell with data, but also what counter narratives about in data do we need for racial justice? And because the entry point into a lot of this work is just thinking about the ways that data and maps have just really have disparately impacted communities of color. And so I'm sharing a map of Los Angeles, but I think there's actually, there are some objects at the Boston Public Library for Boston Hulk maps as well. But what this map is showing is in the 1920s, when there was a lot of federal investment to specific neighborhoods, these red areas, these yellow areas, were predominantly communities of color. And they were the areas that were disinvested in. They were the areas that were rendered, that were based on different categories, deemed as less than worthy of investment. Meanwhile, you see those green and blue areas, those predominantly white communities are rendered as worthy of investment, A and B grades. And those were the ones that got more capital investment and are now more affluent. And we can talk about urbanization, gentrification, moving into the yellow and red areas now as like the reverse of this process. But I'm really thinking about how data categories and mapping kind of coalesce to uplift specific narratives about communities of color, but also render them as just invisible within different topics. And so a great book, in case you want to read more about statistics and how communities of color, especially Black communities, were denigrated. Khalil Gibran Muhammad wrote about how the census and a lot of statistics were really driven to render Black communities as more criminal and really to probe that and prove that. And so as we think about the racist legacies of statistics or census data, we can look to this book and other arguments, other work that's really shown the ways that data, in the name of objectivity and truth, has actually rendered communities of color, specifically in this instance, Black communities, as less than. as inferior, and how data actually upholds those myths and those narratives. More currently, I'm also thinking about work from Ruha Benjamin, Race After Technology, the New Jim Code, in which she's thinking about these complex arguments about race and data, and just how, with the proliferation of technologies, data is encoding and re-encoding a lot of these racial inequalities. We see that in facial rec, as it really fails to recognize non-white faces, or it recognizes male faces better, more accurately, but also the way that it's being used to track and surveil communities of color, namely immigrants, namely hyper-police areas. Yes, and we can dig into that, but like that's just a brief primer of how I'm entering into this project and this study, and thinking about, instead of being a tool for oppression, for inequality, can urban data be a tool for accountability, for transparency, for liberation, for collective efficacy? How do we counter map with data? How do we tell counter narratives with and about data for racial justice? And so finally, just kind of wrapping all that intro up, thinking about, if urban data is the answer, what is the question? What are the questions, new questions that we need? So to get at that, I'm gonna try to present briefly an academic study. It's really proposing a novel typology of data activism, but I really want to center and think through with you all the geospatial maps and the geospatial data examples that I have, and thinking through different categories of data activism. For example, thinking about, how do community organizations use data? How do they collect data to address knowledge gaps? But also, how do they reuse available sources of data, right? So we're talking about, in this age of datafication, social media data, website data, transactional data, there's data everywhere. But how do these community organizations reappropriate data that was not always intended for their use, to advocate for themselves? And then that lends to like different modes of data production, both quantitative, qualitative, oral histories, and map making. Yeah, I think that's very much a standard thing of research. And then finally, thinking through the strategy of data refusal. In light of resistance, in light of political campaigns against the collection of data, against privacy infringements, how are different organizations advocating for racial justice, but also resisting specific types of data collection, data applications? Okay, and so how do all these organizations use, reuse, produce, refuse data to call attention to issues of racial and social inequality? And so this first set of examples, they come from the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. I worked with them on a COVID-19 project that I won't be talking about, but I really love a lot of their work, right? So as we think about data use and reuse, they're collecting data. So they're on the ground collecting survey data, interview data, but they're also reusing data. And we'll talk about the reuse in a little bit. But this map itself is just showing how the collection of narratives of displacement and resistance. So they did a lot of oral history work, a lot of interview work, to just capture the impacts of displacement and resistance within these communities that are undergoing a lot of pressure to move and be dispossessed. Meanwhile, to address knowledge gaps, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is also collecting and reusing data to present information about housing protections in light of COVID, right? So I think, I don't know where we all are coming from, but I'm also thinking about Los Angeles, which has insecure housing problem. And so a lot of ways that we render the houseless, unstably housed, to the peripheries. But actually, how are there protections? What are the protections for those tenants? What are the protections in a local area that, as a tenant is undergoing landlord escalation, as landlords invade tenants' privacies and look up their stimulus payments? How might they be protected? How might they need information about those local protections? So that's a lot of the work that Anti-Eviction Mapping Project is doing. And then finally, I love this one because they're reusing, in this map, they're reusing data set about Wedgwood properties, which came to the news in 2019, 2020, because they were leaving a lot, they're one of those speculative housing companies. So they're a corporation that owns and buys properties, especially in San Francisco. And they were in the headlines in 2020 because one of their vacant properties was actually occupied. a group of single moms, single Black and women of color with children occupied this vacant house, just to call attention to the ways in which a lot of the real estate industry actually takes away these properties and doesn't really reinvest in communities that have been displaced. And so this map is just showing how many properties actually Wedgwood owns throughout the Bay Area. And so oftentimes we think about that mom and pop landlord maybe, but how much of real estate across the industry is driven by corporations? How much of that corporate drivenness is actually not putting people forward, but putting profits forward? So that's a lot of the questions that the anti-eviction mapping project's wrestling with and trying to shed light on through their data use and reuse. Meanwhile, thinking about data production, I'm just thinking about this novel map that the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition shared in light of COVID. So again, thinking about housing insecurity in this instance, and why might it be important to know where the hand washing stations are. This is the early stages of COVID, so I think there was not a lot of information about how to keep safe, but also thinking about the most vulnerable and why they might also need these resources to know where their sanitation stations are, especially as all the city services and agencies were locking down in this period. And then finally, as we continue this conversation and we continue to talk about how organizations might refuse data, I'm thinking about our Data Bodies project. They shared a digital defense playbook. You all should read it if you haven't seen it. But it's just thinking about how do we shift who gets to define these problems in data-driven decision-making. How do we generate maps? How do we generate data? How do we collect data about communities to confront these problems and not perpetuate the carceral state, not perpetuate over-policing, housing displacement, urban displacement. And another example of data refusal could be seen in this, in Mi Gente's campaign against Palantir. So to be clear, what you're seeing is actually what people are resisting, the mapping of different events. And so Palantir is a company, a software company that collects and visualizes varied data points. And they've been implicated in a lot of immigration raids. They've been implicated in a lot of weaponizations of data to police communities of color. And so what Mi Gente has been doing is really thinking about who's behind ICE, how do these software companies, how does the data collection, the data mapping overexpose specific individuals and specific communities, as well as how do we fight back and refuse that type of data collection, refuse that data application? What tools do we need to really bring forth data justice and racial justice? So in closing, I hope those mapping examples help shed a light on the different novel strategies and how different organizations are engaging in data activism. It's not a simple refusal, a simple use of data, but really complex ways of thinking, how do you use data? How do you refuse data? How do you produce it in different ways to countermap, to shed light on these issues of racial and social justice? And so in closing, as we move forward, as we continue the discussion, I just look forward to thinking about what are the new modes of data, what are the new modes of mapping that we need to countermap these issues? How do we foster racial and social justice through it all? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matt. That was fantastic. As a reminder, you can drop comments and questions into the comment section on Facebook or YouTube at any time, and we'll try to get to them. But I have a few questions for Matt that I want to start with. Matt, I really like how you frame your talk not as a question, is the data itself good or bad, but rather what are people doing with it, right? And thinking about not kind of reading normative statements into the information, but rather into their social lives. Who uses them? What questions are they asking them? Who gets to be involved? That's certainly a theme that we reiterate time and time again in Bending Lines, that maps aren't true or false, good or bad on their own, but rather we have to ask sort of who's using them, right? So when you talk about what are the questions with urban data, could you maybe first say what are some of the reasons why people or institutions are using them for purposes that we should be skeptical of, right? What are the affordances, what are the power configurations that data makes possible that we might want to resist? What are the questions that the people who are doing bad things with data, what are they asking? What are they after?
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer that question, that's a great question, Garrett, by the way. I think to answer that question, I'm really thinking about a lot of times the smart city, the data-driven narratives really say like, oh, data will solve all our problems. But what they're actually doing is they're removing the political processes in place for the decisions. And and then they're like placing in place of them that we have data dashboards that make these decisions, that automate the data, give different weights to different priorities, and then have a recommendation. But I think, especially in communities of color, the communities I'm thinking about that have been disinvested, powerful actors are served by opaque processes, right? Powerful actors, those that want the status quo, those that want to not disrupt or not want as much social change, they're the ones that benefit from the less political parts of our processes, or the political parts of these decision-making processes being removed. So I think we really need to think about, why do we want to outsource all these decisions? Why do we want to remove community input from where we designate parks and rec, where we think about different traffic stops, and like, yes, data can be good. It improves sanitation services in LA, for example, but also at the same time, I'm thinking about New York City and 311 and how tenants disproportionately don't report on their landlords or any problems because they're afraid that their landlord will escalate, right? Whereas people that have safety and security don't, like, I personally have enough, like, I feel safety, have enough capital that I can tell my landlord, hey, there's something wrong with my apartment. But for those that are in danger of getting pushed out or evicted, why might they not report on their landlord? And so I think we just think, oh, collecting data, analyzing data will solve all our problems. But a lot of my work is pushing back against that and calling into question, like, who does it serve, and in what instances, and what context do we need to know to be able to solve these problems? Maybe with data, maybe without it.
Yeah, I love that. We talk a lot about how can the data really prove it by itself. I showed a brief vignette of a project we did where we took a single data set. We asked cartographers to draw different conclusions, conflicting conclusions from that data set, so that the data in and of itself isn't necessarily arguing one thing or another. And so these appeals to say, well, we made the decision based on the data, kind of obscures the we in present data front and center, right?
Yeah, and I think in that Boston example of the data, right, like thinking of a team of data scientists, probably didn't have any parents or caretakers in that team to think of, oh, why is a 7 a.m. school bell schedule not really the most practical solution for traffic congestion? Think about these teams, like who's represented on teams. I'm often thinking about, like, what are the implications that a lot of these marginalized community members don't always have a seat at the table for these data-driven decisions. And so how do we assert their participation? How do we uplift their voices? Not that they're voiceless, but how do we really spotlight them in these issues?
I want to come back around to that question of how can we do, empowering work with data? But before I do, I want to ask a historical question, which is, we know, of course, that access, the ability to aggregate and manipulate and control geographic information has been a tool of power for centuries. You showed the Polk redlining maps from the early 20th century. In Bending Lines, we look at treaty maps from hundreds of years ago. We think about imperial surveys, which of course were used to control and govern. But could you say something about what's new about the explosion of data information in, let's say, the past 20 years? We all, millions of people now have phones that are constantly pinging out their geographic location. Things like dashboards or platforms like that are relatively new. How does that change, an old story, which is about the power to control geographic information? What is new about, let's say, big data or public data, or the kind of rapid profusion of computer information?
I mean, I think what's really new is like a lot of the platforms that are collecting data, but also getting value out of these data sets, right? So the last 20 years, I think it's not a new story that I think there is like a history or prehistory to big data and thinking about census data, or like a lot of government sources of data. But the contemporary forms, a lot of like And I don't know the crowd, like if you all are dialed into like Google and like privacy concerns, but like all those big tech platforms, but also the smaller platforms that are collecting other sources of geographic data. So I'm thinking about Yelp and how they're collecting consumer data even when you're not using the app, depending what permissions you have set on. On the corporate side, like Yelp, thinking about Yelp, but also thinking about other open source, like nonprofit sources of geographic data collection, and how there's just this narrative of like a massive trove of data sets, and like we're all producing the data sets too, or the data. And so I think not only are we consuming the data, we're producers of the data, and thinking about how these platforms are selling our consumption, selling our production of this data to other companies, how those are informing different sources. So there's a lot to talk about, but I just think I'm going back to Yelp, and thinking about how they also do real estate analytics and how that's part of their marketing strategy, their business portfolio. That, hey, like all these businesses are popping up in these areas. Wouldn't you want to build a big condo development right in this area that's up and coming? We can tell you that it's up and coming before all the census data, because we have real-time data sources, real-time data analytics that prove like all these people are going to these areas. So I think, long story short, to wrap around and sum it up, it's just the amplification of all these processes, but also like the plentitude of just, there's so much data, but also there's a lot of missing data, and we don't really shine light on what's missing, what's not known.
Mm-hmm. Matt, I was wondering, since you've just mentioned Yelp, maybe you could say a bit about the work you've done with Yelp data, and thinking in particular about how, a data set that's produced maybe originally for reasons we should be skeptical of, right? Perhaps to drive speculative development. We can kind of flip that script and take, the same sources, the same information, and make them speak to different ends. Of course, the Antieviction mapping project is doing some of this work as well.
Yeah.
Maybe you could say a little bit about that, and also, about rather than taking a sort of, like we can't use data at all. Like data is inherently bad. We must just say, there's no way to use it for empowering purposes. Could you talk a little bit about some of the experiments you've done on like rethinking and reworking those data sets?
Yeah. So yes, it's a work in progress, and I think somebody was also in the comments asking about this typology. Both of these projects are in process. They're under review. They're kind of getting revised, and they'll be published soon. And they're informing a book project later about thinking about LA and also Detroit, because I'm moving closer to Detroit, thinking about how do we think about data from the ground up? Why might we want to really center how communities are doing data activism? And so onto that end, thinking about Yelp, that Yelp project, I was just kind of calling, like, again, thinking about narratives that we tell with data, but also within platforms. Thinking about Yelp's trove of like hipster coffee shop geolocation data, and like also just the aesthetics, the reviews within the platform. And so I just scraped a bunch of LA coffee shops, mapped them out. I wish I had it handy, but just mapped out the hipster coffee shops overlaid on top of like a lot of gentrification indices. And so a lot of these hipster coffee shops are coalescing or agglomerating around downtown. And thinking about downtown Los Angeles as like the center of a lot of displacement, but also like counter mapping that, because what motivated the study was also like a lot of other real estate companies are using Yelp data to be like, oh, these are the areas that we want to go to. And so how do we counter map that? How do we think about, oh, these are the areas that people are already drawn to? But also coupling it with thinking about the reviews of these different coffee shops. And so the content analysis was just showing that a lot of the reviews, actually, there's a lot of politics at play. There are a lot of contestations, right? There are different narratives in the reviews that don't always get shown when this coffee shop's 5 stars. But actually, there's a 1-star review at a notorious hipster coffee shop that's like, hey, actually, this is not good for the neighborhood. Meanwhile, one of the 5-star reviews is actually saying, hey, the neighborhood should be just happy. They should just welcome any money because they've been a hotbed for drugs, for violence, which perpetuates just these certain narratives about communities of color, and whether or not they have a right to refuse certain data, refuse certain people, refuse certain modes of capitalism, whether or not people and the community members have a right to actually shape how their community is formed in the future. against a lot of these powerful actors in real estate, industrial corporations, to be honest. So.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a couple of questions from our viewers. As a reminder, you can drop questions for Matt or about the Bending Lines exhibition more broadly, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can by the top of the hour. Matt Sayi asks, what are the conditions in which alternative and more emancipatory uses of data are created? Are you finding that the communities themselves are creating the counter-narratives? And I think Sayi actually has a follow-up to the same question. Or does this happen more normally through partnerships, i.e. data scientists working with communities via nonprofits?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Sayi, thank you for that question. And I think I'm thinking a lot about how, especially in the data, so I was trained as a data scientist, but really after being exposed to critical race theory and thinking about urban sociology and its limitations, like really think about these core questions of racial justice. So I think it's really hot right now to be like, oh, like we need partnerships between academic and community organizations. But I think there is and there has been a lot of research that's actually, the academic relationship is sometimes fraught, is sometimes really extractive from a lot of these community organizations. So I think yes and no is my answer in relation to that question of, I do think data scientists have certain technical capacities that might be appealing for a lot of community organizations to make use of, but actually a lot of my work questions whether or not data science is needed, because I do think a lot of community organizations can identify problems, know the problems, they can gather data. It's just this cachet of like the academic pedigree or like certain levels, certain structural things that hinder access, hinder resources for investment into a lot of advanced technological resources. Right, so a lot of these community organizations, they know the problems, they can identify it. They just can't always pay the bills to get the newest computer, to get the newest software, because they have to pay the bills, they have to care for people, and technology is expensive. So I'm thinking about Pierre Crooks and a few of their other colleagues and thinking about how do we actually think about restorative ways, reparative ways, non-extractive ways to use data. I do think it needs to be in partnership with communities, but I also want to spotlight that data scientists are not always the most reflexive, and how to, as a self-identified data scientist, data analyst, how do we be reflexive about our relationships with communities, our investments in communities? How do we actually give back and not just take from them, build up portfolios showing like, oh, cool, this is something I can do with data. But how do we actually make real change? And data doesn't always need to be, I think a lot of data could help, but also a lot of the questions we're wrestling with are like the politics and the processes. And those are not the most data driven at times.
And I'm sure you find this, Matt, as well. There can be a kind of fetishization of methods, right? As if, a billion data points and, really advanced analytical techniques like prove, right? We actually just ran a public instruction course trying to introduce people to what you can do with geospatial data. And one of the things we tried to remind people was sometimes you don't need big data, right? Sometimes you need a paper map, or you need, a community writing, pinning things onto a corkboard. Sometimes those are more appropriate forms of data, and they are in their way data. Data isn't just like the giant computer spitting out millions of lines of code, right?
Absolutely. And I think like circling back to that question, I'm always thinking about, is there anything I can add? Is there anything that data can add when I'm like partnering with community organizations? Because if they already know the problems and they can identify it, then like that's the key, that's the crux of the problem. So the solution identification, right?
Yeah.
So
there's another question here from Jasmine, who asks, the promise of anonymity through aggregation is often not possible for minority groups and not really possible in less populated or rural areas. Any thoughts on the cost of refusal in such cases?
Yes, that is a great question. I don't know if I have any concrete answer, because I think even in my work, I wrestle with focusing on data activism, like how that actually might overexpose some data activism. And so that might actually counter what I'm trying to do, right? That might actually allow those people that we're contesting, we're counter mapping, to actually know our strategies. And so I think special care needs to be taken to really protect communities, vulnerable communities. And when you don't have those numbers, what do you do? Like, how do you not overexpose people? How do you not hypervisibilize them? It's a hard question, and I don't know the exact answer, but I agree that that is a special area of concern. And important.
Where the kind of technical rationality makes it difficult to form alternative ways of knowing, right? If you've got a database or a spreadsheet where only a few values are possible, it's not possible for an individual to say, well, I want to say a little more or a little less, or I want to use a different category, right?
Yeah.
So, thinking about the ways that the structure that the data creator, the data gatherer projects out into the world end up kind of freezing the world in that image, right?
Yep. So,
Matt, I don't know if you know this specific indicators project. I will confess that I don't. But any comment on the Urban Institute's Neighborhood Indicators project and examples of how they are used locally for good or bad?
I don't know what they've been doing recently, but I have followed a little bit. So like the Urban Institute is one of those organizations that's also heavily investing in data science, urban data science. And I think it's helpful to have indicators, but I also think I'm in that school of research that's always pushing more than just comparative quantitative indicators to compare. Like, oh, we don't need to really compare neighborhoods. We really need to know and identify what are the core problems. And sometimes indicators help to like see what are those core problems, but sometimes I think it creates this like, I'm coming from LA, right? So LA always tries to be number one in certain indicators and not number one in certain indicators. And I feel like that creates this problem where we avoid specific scenarios rather than addressing the core problems for the communities.
Yeah.
So that's just my school of.
We've talked a bit about in our own work about some of these indicators. How do you not freeze a certain form of oppression or injustice, right? For instance, if we want to highlight the relationship, let's say, between non-white populations and historic marginalizations, how do we do that without saying non-white populations are inherently marginalized, right, and cannot be otherwise, right? Thinking about what are the, what kind of markers is it even possible to look at, and how do we do that in a way that foregrounds, like, we're provisionally choosing to use the circumstance, but we're not trying to argue that those are inherently another.
And so I think like related to that question is really thinking about how do you do race with data? And I think a lot of my work is not motivated to use racial categories as predictor variables, which I think if you put in aggression or standard like equations, like you can predict, oh, like race is going to be a problem or race is going to predict this. But actually, how do we problematize the racism that's encoded within these racial categories? How do we actually think about why race is such an important category for analysis, but also like what are the structural factors that lead us to be able to better predict somebody's livelihood, their life quality of life based on their zip code, and the racial demographics of that zip code, rather than like, oh yeah, like we can predict if you like, I don't know. I think it's important research in health, and like I might be insulting some epidemiologists, but like, oh yeah, like knowing like you're 0.2 times more likely to die. Really, is that like what we're trying to do, or are we trying to identify the causes of such disparities?
Barbara Fields is great on this topic, of course, saying that, it's not an inherent category of race that makes people more vulnerable to premature death or violence. It's the processes of racism which are acting on them.
Yeah.
And so, again, when we're looking at, let's say, what variables are available in the census or in the American Community Survey, it can be, the census isn't measuring the things that we might want to look at there. So how does one structure a narrative or an analysis that
and I mean
available and flips it in different ways?
And on that topic, I think as an Asian American scholar, like thinking about the politicalness of the Asian American category, and how like there's been a lot of activism around data disaggregation, right? Because East Asians are very different from South Asians, from Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders. And so how do we really have data categories that capture those nuances? Or even just the Asian American category as an umbrella term is political in different ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's a great historic chart that we show in the exhibition. I
Okay.
believe it's from Pew originally, but showing how those census categories have changed over time. The people were not changing. It was just racial attitudes about how to categorize people were
Hmm.
changing over time.
Yeah,
A
definitely.
couple other audience comments. Thanks for the great talk. The typology of data activism projects is super interesting and useful. Can you say more about the stage of your work and how we can follow it?
I think it's under review. It's getting revised. Hopefully, it'll get published eventually, and then that, yeah. I'm trying not to say any more, but I mean, hopefully, a book project will be coming in 2 to 3 years based on more extended arguments about all this. So, hoping to come back. So,
Cool.
stay
Yeah,
tuned.
I'll say too, Matt gave a talk a few months ago now at the Oxford Internet Institute that goes into some of the same themes. And I invite you to take a look at that too, where you can see a bit more about his work. A question from Lynn Brown, who's actually on our education staff. Lynn would love to hear a concrete example or two about how communities can refuse data collection individually and collectively. What steps should we be exploring together? And also, what approaches to data collection should we encourage?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great conversation, a great question. I think refusing data collection in particular, I'm really thinking about surveillance technologies right now, or surveillance data. So I think there's a growing discussion and question and campaign, and I think I can email links later to like some of the more activist organizations, but against like proctoring tools and thinking about educational spaces and like why do we really need to have all eyes on these students as they're doing test taking? How does that actually get weaponized against a lot of students of color? Um, Collectively, individually, I'm also thinking about that Mi Gente example. Their No Tech for ICE campaign, they are also in the process, or I think they might have just finished, but like protesting the Chicago PD database. I think that actually was successful. But think about local scales of data collection. What are the local campaigns against data collection that you can take part in? Data for Black Lives, which actually started in Boston, is also a good resource, as well as the Algorithmic Justice League. There's a lot of cool things happening in Boston that are calling attention to these collection of data, the analysis of data, but also like what should we refuse? So I think Boston, if you're in Boston, those are great organizations. The Allied Media Project also probably has some campaigns, some resources for that as well.
Matt, maybe you could say something about what some of just the practical, even technical challenges are. I'm sure you know as well as we do that geographic information, geospatial data isn't super easy to work with, right? I don't know the story of how you pulled down the Yelp data, but it's certainly for non-technical experts. There's a huge wall or learning curve that stands between, empowering uses of data. As you mentioned, like the academy is increasingly interested in community partnerships, but has its own agenda and can be inaccessible in its own way. So what are some of the ways that ordinary, like you mentioned some of these community organizations, what are the tools, what are the resources, what are the actual things that people might need in order to make data and information and analysis a little more broadly accessible?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the practical ways to redistribute resources, I think in a way, is thinking about how universities, academic institutions have software licenses already paid for. And so I think a lot of times when I'm in community partnership, I'm the one tasked with doing a lot of the GIS work because, I mean, I know GIS, but I'm not like the best expert for like more complicated things. So I do rely on like Esri, kind of like more private software, the proprietary software. So I think the open source stuff is great. I just haven't had a chance to learn it. And so I think that's one way, like easily redistribute resources and like empower community organizations, but also like tutorials on that. I think access is just one of the biggest issues, but also time, because if you think about like, I think community organizations, they're great, but also they're overloaded. And so learning a new skill, taking the time to develop those skills is so hard. So I think we really need to think about resources in that area. I know public libraries are also often sources for GIS software sometimes. It depends on the resources in a library, a specific library. those are avenues as well.
Yeah,
Yes,
and
I
certainly
mean,
thinking about that political economy of resources, right? Even a small like private firm might have a small army of data analysts, data managers, whereas for a community organization, of course,
yeah,
institutions like ours are trying to promote these kind of resources, but the number of people, the number of resources is spread
yeah.
rapidly. And so thinking about what would it take at the structural level to build
Yeah,
institutions that support that kind of work.
yeah. And I mean, I think libraries are always doing great work, but I think I'm also aware of like, oh, the libraries need to do more because they're so overloaded always already. And I'm thinking about the LA context of like the houses patrons that they're serving, that they're trying to accommodate and learn how to deal, and their technological needs, but at the same time dealing with all the other things that they're overloaded with. So that's why I'm like, oh yes, I think libraries are important, but I also am very aware that they're one of the resources that keep losing funding, but lose the funding, right? So how do we empower them? How do we have communities step into those gaps? So.
We've got about 10 minutes left, so feel free to add some comments. We've got a couple that I'll bring up right now. I know that Dr. Boo would be more than happy to follow up afterwards too, if you don't get a chance, or if we don't get a chance to answer your question now. There's one here from RDH Warburton, who says, new form of redlining. Any comments on the use of colors? Red is now bad. It might plot health, but still color the minority areas as bad.
I mean, I think that question I would defer to a lot of designers and just thinking about like color design, color theory. I don't have really any strong opinions. I just think my go-to is really thinking about intuitive coloring, gradations, and then also like kind of following best practices of like colleagues and other organizations in terms of coloring.
And those subtle connotations, right? Like for instance, red is bad. We have quite a few maps indenting lines that use red to denote alarm or to try to rile people up, right? Going back hundreds of years, red has had that effect. But we also, we talk about how sometimes choices are unintentional, right? So if you open up GIS software and you just randomly assign colors, like red might be one of those colors, right? And so, are you accidentally showing something as maybe looking bad simply because you just decided to let the technical affordances of that system choose for you?
Yeah, definitely.
A question from Alan, who I assume must be in the UK. We've just had our 10-year census here. It seems a lot of us angry at Brexit used the opportunity to make a point. A nationality box, which has options like British or Welsh, people ticked other and then wrote in European, just for as an example.
Yeah, I mean, my comments on we just did our census too in the United States, and there's a lot of questions about the data quality, about who's represented in this data. I'm especially thinking about the communities that I'm working with, or thinking about of how communities of color are among the most hard to count, and rural populations as well are among the most hard to count. And so when we moved to digital only, even before COVID, but then digital only census data collection and disinvest in like kind of more on the ground data collection, how that might impact the data, how that's, I mean, there's a lot, it's hard to know because was it COVID, was it hard to collect data? But I think there's a lot of questions about the census too, and the quality of that data.
Yeah, and being careful when missing data is not even shown as missing, right? The assumption that a data set captures the whole universe of reality. And, certainly that's something that we can always keep in mind, is that no data set, no geographic representation, no map, whether it's mischievous and trying to dominate, or whether it's trying to act in a more liberatory fashion, it's never going to capture the complexities of the world itself. It's always going to have simplifications and omissions and flattenings.
And I mean, just another point related is that a lot of that census data is used to make all our resource allocation decisions within local and state governments. And so when those hard to count populations are underrepresented, they're even more under-resourced. So just to make that point.
Exactly. And, as some of the questions have flagged, simply including them or bringing in that information is not always the right option, right? Think about missing just reference map data about places in the global south. Adding that kind of information to systems like OpenStreetMap can be good for humanitarian purposes, but it can also, serve military surveillance. It can serve, commercial speculation. And so is more data better data? It's a question of who's doing it and why.
There's a piece about data justice by Shikar and Heeks that's like, oh, actually, like internationally, or like thinking about NGOs and their collection of data, it actually serves the NGOs more than the marginalized communities to collect such data, and like thinking about, oh, like data collection and a lot of these themes, a lot of these recurring arcs of this conversation.
Yeah.
So if, in case you want to nerd out, Shikar and Heeks, data justice, you should be able to find it at a library. It's a journal article.
Great. Great. Well, we're nearing the top of the hour. I'm going to put up Dr. Bouie's website, matthewbowie.com, where you can find his contact information and more about his works in progress and publications. I know he'd be happy to have folks reach out there. And I also want to say a few things about what's coming up at the Map Center. So taking a critical approach to data justice isn't just something that we're interested in with the Bending Lines exhibition. We're also developing programs and services designed to support data literacy as well, and to help empower people with these kinds of tools that we've been discussing. In the months to come, we'll be running the second iteration of our new course called Making Sense of Maps and Data. That's a free adult program. And we're about to release our own data access portal to the public, where you can find kind of guided interpretive data sets about Boston and the region that are useful for these kinds of purposes. On our website, there's also many other resources around data and critical data studies, including a series of articles called Get to Know Your Data, where we talk with folks who manage public data sets, primarily in Massachusetts, and think about like what are they doing with that data and how do they how can people work with it, as well as both training and documentation about geospatial resources. This series continues next week with Luis Alvarez-Leon, a geographer at Dartmouth College, who will talk with us about how maps and geographic data underpin the digital economy. You may have heard the phrase, data is the new oil. Certainly data is valuable. There's a reason why a lot of money surrounds data analytics, and Luis will be talking a little bit more about that with us. Same time, Wednesday at noon, same place, our YouTube and Facebook channels. For all of these, you can sign up online at our website, leventhalmap.org. You can also follow us on social media at BPL Maps to get more information about our programs and our collections. Please join me in thanking Dr. Matt Bouie for having such a wonderful conversation with us today and really kicking off this month-long series of talks. I encourage you to reach out to him and to get in touch, and also to spend more time on his website and as well as on the Bending Lines digital exhibition when you have a chance. Yep. Thanks, Matt. It's been really great to have you.
Thanks for having me. Maybe next time we'll be in person.
Yeah, won't that be great? I will say that we don't yet have an opening date. The library is still closed. But we hope within the next several months we'll begin to start welcoming people back once again. If you liked today's program, we'd love to get your thoughts. We have a short feedback survey. Tell us what we could do next time, and tell us what other sorts of free programs or free events you'd like to see in the future. And again, tune in next week. Again, Wednesday on YouTube and Facebook Live for our second series of the Angles on Bending Lines conversations. Take care, everyone.